things that's most frustrating about conversations about these new technologies is we have a tendency to talk about them and specifically about our concerns about them as if the bad things might happen in the future, right? Like, so we talk about like, oh, the problem with automating driving cars, like what will happen if it sees a box of puppies and a bicyclist, like which one will it hit? And I'm actually not saying that that's an unimportant question. That's actually a really important question. We actually should pay attention to that.
That is coming quick too.
Yeah, but we have a tendency to talk about these challenges as if they're happening and potentially happening in the future. And one of the things that was most frustrating about that to me is that the conversations all tended to stay really abstract. And what I was seeing in communities that I work in and live in was that people are being affected by these tools right now in some really profound ways that have major impacts on their ability to meet their own needs. And so one of the reasons I made this switch into journalism and away from the academy, though I think academic work is incredibly important and useful, is that it was really important for me to tell these stories from the point of view of people who are targets of these systems. So people like Sophie Stipes' family, folks like Patrick and Angel, the people who feel like the targets of these systems and really have a lot to offer the world about like what we should be paying attention to. And they were just really left out of the conversation in most of the rooms that I was in talking about this stuff. So that's the first thing of like, how do you link the big picture abstract concerns with like what to do about it in the work that you all do, is how important it is to be talking to folks who are on the ground and dealing with these systems right now, right? I think we experiment with some of the most intrusive and invasive systems in communities where there's sort of low expectation that people's rights will be respected. So that's low-income communities, that's communities of color, that's communities of undocumented migrants, and that's around the world in war zones as well. So that's where we should always be starting.
Sure.
That's at least a place to start.
And we touched on the idea of digital inclusion, and that seems to be important to this conversation in a couple of different ways. And what strikes me from some of the work I've done as a digital inclusion fellow for a national nonprofit organization, the idea that if we can reach people who are not digitally savvy, not connected, and get them connected and teach them the tools, do you think that actually will help them fight back against what they're experiencing at this end of automating their inequality, or not?
Yeah, so this is a really important question. I appreciate you raising that. So I come from a background in community technology, the community technology movement. So for the first 10 or 15 years of my work, I was really focused on making sure that communities had access to the technical tools they needed to be fully engaged in the world we live in today. And I still think that's incredibly crucial work. I will say one of the challenges my work offers to that frame, a loving challenge my work offers to that frame, is that we tend to only think about injustice in terms of exclusion. And we have more trouble sometimes thinking about injustice that happens when you are included into a system that exploits you. And so in poor and working communities, my experience has been that the kinds of why digital inclusion is so important, why public digital inclusion is so important, is that poor and working communities often have to make this incredibly tough call. Like, we know we need to be involved with this, but the avenues we have open to involvement all mean that we have to give up information we shouldn't be required to give up, mean that we're being charged exorbitant rates for access that other people get at more reasonable rates, right? So I think digital inclusion, fair and just digital inclusion, is an absolutely primary first step to us addressing these problems, because people find themselves in these situations not because they don't know enough. I actually think most of the people I talk to know more about these systems than I do, right? And it was really hard for me to keep up with their really good instincts. They might not have the right name for every system they're talking about, but they've got really good instincts about how they work. But really the problem is they're backed into a situation where they don't feel like they have a lot of choices, a lot of meaningful choices. And so anything we can do to increase the meaningful choices about how people engage with these systems is crucial.
I want to give you a chance to touch on the solutions. Because you talked about those a little bit, or in the book, certainly. I was struck by a line that you used that talked about our cultural denial of poverty and how we see it and look away.
Yeah.
And what strikes me is this idea that it's one thing to say that we as a society, we as a people, need to think differently about poverty. And then I'm also was interested in what you had to say in the book about that it's the design of the technology. And I think we all know that with most technology, it's what you input. So how do you marry those two things up, where you're talking about big societal change of people's value versus getting down to some tech design thing that's going to get inputted to spit out and do all these things you're talking about?
Yeah, so it's such I know that when I come and do these kind of talks, one of the things that people really want to bust out their notebooks for is when I give them the 5-point plan for building better technologies. And I am happy and sorry to say that I don't do that. And I don't do that because I'm a coward, though that might be a little bit of it. But mostly I don't do it because I actually do think a lot of these changes are much deeper than tinkering with the technology, right? So I think one of the first things we have to do is change the story we tell about poverty, right? So we have this crazy story in the United States that poverty is an aberration, that it's something that only happens to a tiny percentage of possibly pathological people. The reality is that 51% of us will be poor at some point in our adult lives, and that a full 2/3 of us will access means-tested public services. So that's straight welfare. That's not like reduced price school lunches. That's not Social Security. That's straight welfare. So poverty is already a majority issue in the United States. The majority of us will face poverty at some point in our life. That doesn't mean we all face it equally. That's really important to say. If you're born poor, if you're a person of color, if you have a mental health issue, if you have a physical disability, if you're an undocumented migrant, you're much more vulnerable to poverty, and it's much harder to escape it once you're there. But the reality is it's a majority issue. So we have to start telling the story that makes sense of that truth, rather than this idea that we have to do all this very complicated moral tinkering to decide, which tiny percentage of poor folks deserve support. We just need to move to universal floors rather than these moral thermometers that I talk about. And that's going to take a lot of political work. That's the middle step. A lot of political work. And this is not, partisan, right? That's going to take political work for every party that we have in the United States, including the Democratic Socialists. So that's a lot of work. And in the meantime, these technologies aren't going to just stop and wait for us to figure it all out, so that we produce better technologies. So I think one of the things I often suggest to designers is, we're building tools that don't have the resources they need to actually navigate the world we live in, right? So I say, what we're doing? We're building cars that have no gears in a city like San Francisco, right? The landscape of inequality in the United States is full of as many steep hills and as many twisty turns as the city of San Francisco. And if you build this car, this tool with no gears, we should not then be surprised when it zips down the hill and crashes at the bottom, right? So we need to build for justice on purpose, and that means building gears into the car. So rather than trying to remove bias after the fact, we have to start with our really key democratic values of justice and equity. Thanks for that.
Wow. Well, Virginia, this book certainly makes a very strong statement about, not letting data or letting people be reduced to data. It's really about need to flip that and make sure that we are elevating everyone, especially the people that we serve, to that higher level of humanity that we would expect for ourselves, our neighbors, our friends, our families. So thank you again for coming to Kansas City. Thank you for helping us be part of this conversation that you have really kicked off with this book nationally, and we appreciate your time. Thank you, Virginia. Appreciate it.